adult political career when I won't be voting for the Republican nominee for president. I won't be voting for Joe Biden either. I'll write in the name of a Republican conservative yet to be determined. But I'm very clearly of the view that Donald Trump's not competent to be president. I don't think he's a philosophical conservative. He's not up to the job. And while I'm really confident that we can correct the problems and mistakes made in his first term, both domestically and internationally, I'm really very worried about what would happen to the country if he had a second term. And so from that perspective, election day this year is not going to be a happy day for me one way or the other. I'm going to be unhappy with the result.
Another of the speakers last night was Republican John Kasich, former congressman and governor of Ohio. Do you see John Kasich's endorsement of Joe Biden as significant? Do you see more Republican leaders advocating for the Joe Biden-Kamala Harris ticket in November? You've already said that you're maintaining neutrality in this and will vote for somebody else.
Well, I would expect more Republicans will vote for Biden from the Democrats' point of view. It's obviously a sensible strategy. What I'm really thinking about more than anything is the discussion that we'll have to have within the Republican Party beginning on November the 4th, really whether Trump wins or loses. Most urgently and immediately, of course, if Trump loses, about what we do as a party to cut this albatross off from around our neck. I take a sort of a Lincolnian view within the party of how to handle this, which is appropriate since we're all Republicans, and that's with malice toward none and charity toward all. If people want to vote for Biden, that's not what I'm going to do, but I respect their choice to do it. I think a number of people will do what I'm going to do. They're going to vote for somebody else if their state election laws permit that. And I think a lot of Republicans simply won't vote for the top of the ticket one way or the other. I hope they vote in Senate and other down ballot races because I think it's critical for the Republicans to maintain control of the Senate. But my point is, after the election, I think anybody who takes one of those routes ought to be part of the conversation, as should the people who voted for Trump, many of whom I believe are not voting for Trump because they favor him, but because they're afraid of what the left wing of the Democratic Party would do in a Biden administration, as am I. But for the sake of the party, we've got to get past this Trump era. And I think there'll be a struggle, but I think we can do it. There is no Trumpism. There is no Trump doctrine in foreign policy. There is no Trump philosophy. It's personal, it's idiosyncratic, it's anomalous. But the damage that's been done has to be corrected. I think that will be a very important task to begin, even if he wins re-election.
You mentioned November 4, which may be optimistic this year for having an outcome from the election. I'm interested in your view on the president's actions regarding the U.S. Postal Service as we approach the election, and wondering whether he might be creating a self-fulfilling prophecy by criticizing the Postal Service and attempting to cut services at the same time, all within 3 months of the election. Can you share your views on that?
Well, let me just say, as someone who spent 31 days in Florida in the aftermath of the 2000 election when Al Gore contested the result, just to make it plain here, contested results can come from both parties. I don't look forward to an election where we have 10 Floridas all around the country. And to date, I haven't seen evidence that convinces me that the president's really trying to sabotage the election, although he came very close yesterday. And I was very troubled to hear him say, if he was quoted correctly, and I'll underline the word if there, that the only way he can lose the election is if it were stolen from him. He might yet win. I think there's little doubt that it's still a possibility, but it also won't be a surprise if he loses. And I would count on Republicans, if it looks like Trump has entered into that kind of thinking, either before the election or certainly after the election, to be the first ones to say, we will not accept it. We will accept a legitimate contest in a state where the vote is close or it's uncertain, but not going to accept a generalized rejection of the election process in advance which happens sometimes in countries that are not so good at elections as we are. I was very troubled by that remark yesterday, and I think this is something people ought to focus on. In terms of the Postal Service, I can speak as a somewhat distant authority. For 2 summers in college, I was a temporary summer letter carrier in the post office in Baltimore, and I'll tell you, even back then, it was no model of efficiency, and a lot can be done to improve it. So let's hear from the Postmaster General. He's testifying, I think, this Friday. Before we jump to conclusions.
You alluded to this. If Donald Trump does lose the election, and knowing what you do about Donald Trump, the person, do you think there's a possibility that that he will attempt to stay in office?
Well, I don't think he may attempt anything. Look, under Trump, there are no rules except what benefits Donald Trump. I think this is nonetheless not a moment to get apocalyptic before we have more evidence. That's why I was so disturbed by his comment yesterday, as reported by the press, because I think that to try and say in advance the only fair outcome is when I win is something that we should pause over. This is going to call for some leadership by Republicans. I know what the Democrats will say if we get into it, but I think back to the resignation of Richard Nixon. And what really got that moving was Republicans. Jim Buckley, not even a Republican himself, a conservative from New York, was the first senator on the Republican side, we'll call it, to say Nixon should resign. And when the delegation of Republican senators went to Nixon to tell him he had lost support, it was really Barry Goldwater more than anybody who carried the day. So I think we ought to be thinking about this in advance. Again, I don't want to draw more conclusions than the evidence permits, and I think there is a reasonable basis. Al Gore certainly thought there was a reasonable basis in Florida to contest an election. And there may be in this election in November. What's reasonable to do within the law, people should not get upset about. What begins to get unreasonable, we ought to look for some evidence for.
Security analyses indicate Russia and China may already be trying to influence the election. How seriously should we be taking those threats?
Well, I think we should take those threats very seriously. I think other countries are trying to interfere as well. Some have mentioned Iran, some have mentioned North Korea. This is nothing new. Back in the Cold War, we saw the Soviet Union try to influence Hollywood and the entertainment industry. Vice President Pence has given a very important speech on China's reach into our civic political discourse, not just hacking the election. To me, this is an attack on the Constitution when foreign governments try to interfere like this, and I think it should be met with the strongest response. In my book, I talk about some of the things we did during my service to try and strengthen our defenses, and I might say strengthen our offenses in cyberspace against election interference, and I think it's very important. Denying that foreign governments are trying to, I think, delegitimize our institutions being the most fundamental goal, to cause Americans to distrust our system and each other, is something that is very, very dangerous for us.
We have a question from one of our National Press Club members, Shannon Vavra, reporter for CyberScoop. It's been reported by Yahoo News there was a presidential finding issued in 2018 that gave the CIA more leeway to carry out covert cyber operations against adversaries, including disruptive or destructive operations. Under what circumstances do you think the U.S. government should carry out these kinds of cyber operations? Do you believe these kinds of operations from the CIA would undermine or complement cyber command operations?
Well, I'll speak hypothetically here, and I would refer people to my book for what we actually did during my time there in terms of revising some of the excessively restrictive Obama administration procedures. But I would say this as a general proposition. Cyberspace is no different than any other venue for human activity. And when people try and use it adversely against us, I think it's entirely legitimate for us to take offensive measures, not to engage in endless conflict, but to set up structures for deterrence, so that if, as they have before and undoubtedly are in the 2020 election, trying to interfere, that Russia and China learn to their detriment that they will pay a price, indeed a price in excess of the price of the cost that they impose on us for trying to do it. That's how you establish deterrence. And I think it's not only legitimate, I think it's necessary to help maintain the confidence of American voters that our system's integrity can be protected.
Russian President Vladimir Putin seems to be a focal point of so much of President Trump's foreign policy, and so much remains a mystery regarding their relationship. What can you tell us about the relationship between these two men, President Trump and President Putin?
Well, I think Trump's basic approach to Russia has been that he simply is unable or unwilling to acknowledge that the Russians tried to interfere in the 2016 election. And he responds that way because he thinks even acknowledging the attempt to interfere would validate his opponent's narrative and undercut the legitimacy of his own election. I think that's completely false logic. I think that if we hadn't had to drag him kicking and screaming along with most of the steps we've taken against Russia in response to their election interference, he would be much more credible on this subject. I know there's a lot of speculation about what he and Putin discussed in their one-on-one at the Helsinki summit. I am very confident that there was nothing discussed that was adverse to the United States. I think Trump himself has acknowledged he has an affinity for authoritarian leaders, and I'll leave it to the shrinks in the audience to figure out why that is. I look at it from a policy point of view. I think Trump interferes with his own story by this unwillingness to hear anything bad said about Putin or to challenge him on interference in American affairs. Trump has a problem distinguishing his personal relationships with foreign leaders with the actual bilateral relationship between the United States and that country. And in fact, it doesn't interfere with the personal relationship to advance your own country's interest. You do it in a polite and professional way, and everybody understands it. Certainly people like Putin and Xi Jinping understand it. They do it all the time. Trump should be able to do it too, but he doesn't like to.
We have a question from Voice of America reporter Eung Jung Cho. This month, President Trump said several times that if he didn't win the election in 2016, the U.S. would have been in a war with North Korea, but that he stopped it. Do you agree with that assessment, and how close was the United States to a war with North Korea in 2017?
Well, the statement by the president's ridiculous. What he's referring to is conversations he had with outgoing President Obama during the transition, where Obama told him, by not just Trump's account, but by others, that North Korea was probably the biggest threat that he would face, and that they were making rapid progress toward their long-term objective of deliverable nuclear weapons. Now, let me just stop there. One reason that North Korea was such a problem at the end of 2016 was Obama's 8 years of failure to do anything about it. So let's just put that in proper context. But when Trump came in, he didn't have the slightest idea what North Korea's nuclear weapons program was really about in terms of its threat level, and I don't think he's learned much since then. I don't think we were seriously close to war under Trump in 2017. I think, in fact, he spent a fair amount of that time, this is before I came on board, hoping that he could finally set up a summit with Kim Jong-un, which he did ultimately in June of 2018. And we've now finished, I hope we finished 2+ years of fanciful diplomacy, chasing the idea that this personal relationship between Trump and Kim Jong-un would produce a solution to the North Korean nuclear threat, which it has not. In fact, over 3.5 years of the Trump administration, because of pursuing this fantasy, the North Koreans have continued to make progress on ballistic missiles and undoubtedly on the sophistication of their nuclear weapons. So we're 3.5 years closer to a real threat to the United States than we were before Trump took office.
We have a follow-up question from the same reporter. Can you tell us about the bloody nose strike that was considered in 2017?
Not really, because I wasn't there in 2017, and others can comment on it. This is a very complex subject, and one that is the sort of thing that worries me when Trump gets around it. I describe in my book sort of the opposite scenario where he and all of his advisors had agreed to a strike in retaliation for Iran's belligerent activity, shooting down an American drone, attacking ships near the Persian Gulf, attacking the Saudi oil infrastructure. And at the very last minute, somebody flies into the room and tells him something that's inaccurate, and he calls the strike off. Which was the most irrational thing I've ever seen a president do. Now, a lot of people say, well, great, he didn't use force. My point is, if you're irrational in your approach, even if the end result in a particular case is not using force, you can be irrational in your approach in a different case and end up using force. This should, I think, discomfort everybody, conservative, moderate, or liberal, who worries about effective decision-making inside the U.S. government.
Miles Taylor, the former chief of staff to President Trump's Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, yesterday called the president's actions with the department terrifying. The president, he said, routinely tried to warp Homeland Security policy to his own benefit and said cyber attacks and terrorism threats are not his priorities. Mr. Taylor yesterday announced his support for Joe Biden. What do you make of those accusations?
Well, I think that's certainly consistent with what I saw during my tenure. I do think it is fundamental to understanding Trump that he sees things almost exclusively through the prism of what benefits him. And it's true not just in the national security space, but I think on domestic issues as well. And you know, he was focused on the Mexican border to the point of obsession, and I think still is. It's a serious issue. There's no doubt about it. Nobody should blink at it. But the way he approached it was really on the basis, as he said, that this was the issue that got him elected in 2016, and if he didn't get his wall in place, it would unelect him in 2020.
Let's talk for few minutes about the Israeli-United Arab Emirates agreement to normalize relations. Do you see this as a bellwether?
Well, I think it could presage further agreements between Israel and other Arab states, resolving many of the issues that have been discussed for so long. I think it reflects the changing geostrategical reality in particularly the Arabian Peninsula area. I think the oil-producing Arabs have been deeply concerned about Iran's poorly disguised efforts at regional hegemony. I think they see the obvious merit of growing closer to Israel, marrying Israeli technology and entrepreneurship with oil revenues, having greater intelligence and military cooperation, all of which I think is entirely in the best interest of the United States. So I think it was an excellent outcome, and one that hopefully will produce other similar announcements in the future.
How much of the credit for this should go to the administration?
Well, I think the administration can take some credit for it. I think their efforts contributed to it. I think it's an example of showmanship, though, for the president to announce it first and act as though he was responsible for it. But they certainly deserve some credit. There's no doubt about that.
What's the role of Jared Kushner in foreign policy, and including Middle East, where the president gave him a pretty large portfolio?
Well, I've said before, Jared's the second most powerful person in the White House, and he dips in and dips out of this area. He's a kind of dilettante in that respect. I think this is uh, a good lesson in why your close relatives should not work in a decision-making structure like that. It's very, very hard to have an orderly decision-making process. Look, people's relatives give them advice all the time. There's nothing wrong with that. It's human nature. It's not going to change. But to be that proximate to the president, I think can sometimes lead to difficulties. And we may see more when the history of the Trump administration is written when everybody's out of the White House.
In the broader sense, could you talk a little bit about what you see as the failings or shortcomings of diplomacy today in resolving matters?
Can you be more specific than that? Our diplomacy, somebody else's diplomacy? What
Sure.
you have in mind?
Well, our diplomacy tactics seem to have changed within this administration. Are we following any certain track at this point?
No, this is goes back to the point I made a moment ago. Trump's an anomaly. It doesn't what I think when he leaves the scene, hopefully in January of next year, but maybe 4 years after that, I think his legacy in that sense will disappear like water smoothing over. It's there isn't any Trump diplomacy. There's just Trump, and when he disappears, I think his style will disappear with him. At least I hope so.
And if he's reelected, does an anomaly become something different?
Well, I think it becomes much more of a problem. As I said a moment ago, I think we can correct and mitigate the damage that he's caused in the first 4 years, but 8 years of it may make some of it irreparable. I don't think we can afford it.
Last Friday, you may be aware, marked the 8th anniversary of a young journalist named Austin Tice being held in captivity in Syria. You perhaps know the National Press Club and our Journalism Institute and other press freedom groups have been actively supporting Austin's family in their effort to bring their son home. In your book, you say, and I'm going to quote here, all these negotiations about our role in Syria were complicated by Trump's constant desire to call Assad on U.S. hostages, which Secretary of State Pompeo and I thought undesirable. Fortunately, Syria saved Trump from himself by refusing even to talk to Pompeo about them. When we reported this, Trump responded angrily, "You tell them he will get hit hard if they don't give us our hostages back. We want them back within 1 week of today, or they will never forget how hard we hit them." That's the end of the quote. Oh no, I'll continue. That at least took the Trump-Assad call off the table. We didn't act on the talk about striking Syria. Ambassador Bolton, Mark and Deborah Tice, Austin's parents, are going to see this conversation you and I are having this morning. Could you talk for a moment to them about your stand on this and about where we are on this?
Well, I think anybody who's in the position that I held is going to be aware of how strongly feel about their family and friends being held hostages around the world. And Americans in many places are and will continue to be targets of hostage takers who use them as bargaining chips. It's very, very cold-blooded. I think the United States has a continuing obligation to protect all of its citizens anywhere in the world. I believe in civis Romanus sum applied to Americans. I think when Americans are taken, that's a direct affront to us as a country. And I think we ought to do what we can to get them back. But we need to do it in a way that doesn't up the price to get other Americans back or to encourage hostage taking. So in the passage from my book that you read, I equated a call from Trump to Assad as giving a wretched little dictator more legitimacy than he deserved, and probably upping the price for all of the Americans, including Austin Tice, held by the Syrians or their surrogates in Syria and in Lebanon. So this is an area that I personally spent time on in my tenure, and I think it's important that all Americans know when they travel overseas that the full weight of the American government is going to be supporting them.
Uh, Last Friday also, I want to stay on this for a moment, both President Trump and Secretary Pompeo issued statements of support. The president said, and I'm quoting, there is no higher priority in my administration than the recovery and return of Americans missing abroad. The Tice family deserves answers. We stand with the Tice family and will not rest until we bring Austin home. Secretary Pompeo, in his statement, pledged his unwavering support in the effort. It sounds like philosophically they align with where you are on this. I'm curious as to whether your thinking has evolved since your time as National Security Advisor on this. And the bottom line is, how do we make this young man's freedom and the freedom of the other hostages happen?
Well, look, I don't think Trump has a philosophy. I think he sees hostage releases as big events for him. Personally, I think they're obviously critical to the hostages involved and to their families and to the country. But I take a pretty narrow view of what Trump's objectives are. This is a sometimes very difficult process. It depends on the circumstances of the individual hostage, and I'll say it flatly. I don't think you can coddle these dictators simply in an effort to get hostages back. I don't think we've done enough, for example, to let Kim Jong-un know that his regime's treatment of Otto Warmbier, who was taken hostage for no reason whatever and came back a terrible shell of his former self and died shortly thereafter, is any victory for the United States. And this goes to the question, which I invite you to comment on if you want, of how to get hostages back without making it more attractive for the government you're dealing with or other governments to think the price for the hostages is something we will pay any price for, and thus put other Americans like Otto Warmbier in jeopardy.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to switch subjects here now. What, if any, benefits has the average American seen from the president's tariff wars?
Well, look, there are a lot of tariff wars. That's part of the problem. Trump likes tariffs. He says that. I've always been a free trader. So instinctively, I react in the other direction. I don't think, however, you can deny that in some cases, in trade arrangements that the U.S. has negotiated, we haven't negotiated very well. And therefore, correcting these deficiencies is a good thing. Not every tariff agreement is a free trade agreement. That's what they're called, but often they're simply managed trade agreements. And I thought one of the things Trump said was really his finest hour with the Europeans was to say, why don't we eliminate all tariffs, all subsidies, and all regulations that interfere with trade? Whoa, said the Europeans. What do you mean? That really would be free trade, and it would be. That's what we should strive for. Now, the issue of trade that is most important today is with China. And I think, and I explain this at some length in my book, we have pursued a misguided policy on China across the board for decades. And I think we've been taken advantage of by China. Their theft of intellectual property, their forced technology transfer, their discrimination against foreign corporations is something that was long overdue to be addressed. And in that sense, the first imposition on tariffs on China, I think, was like a 2x4 between the eyes to Beijing to say, we're not going to take it anymore. Now, there are a lot of other issues involved here. And I think one of Trump's problems is that he sees almost the whole China relationship through the prism of trade. And it's very hard to get him to focus on other issues, other than today when it's in his political interest to be tough because of their treatment of the Uyghurs, tough because of their repression of Hong Kong, and so on. So in the arsenal of U.S. diplomatic weapons, I wouldn't put tariffs aside at all. But I think in the way Trump looks at these things, it's something he can do by himself. He doesn't need Congress, and I think it's kind of reflex action that doesn't reflect the strategy, which is fairly typical of the way he operates.
Let me remind our viewers and our listeners that we're speaking with Ambassador John Bolton about his book, The Room Where It Happened, and matters of interest today. We have a question from Lisa Matthews of the Associated Press. What do you make of the developing situation in Belarus? There are reports that the leader of Belarus has been in touch with President Putin, and we could potentially see Russia take over the country.
Well, I think it's a very, very serious matter, one that I paid attention to in my waning days as National Security Advisor, and something that really does involve U.S. national security interests directly. I think that Putin would like to find a way, well before the current demonstrations in Belarus, to reabsorb that country back into some kind of amalgamation with Russia. It's consistent with his effort generally to reestablish Russian hegemony in the space of the former Soviet Union in Central and Eastern Europe. And why is this critical to the United States? Because of Belarus's geographical position bordering not just on Russia, but on Ukraine and Poland. And in fact, one of the last things I did in Warsaw in September of 2019, at the behest of Poland and the Ukraine, they convened a meeting of the national security advisors of those two countries, Belarus and myself, for the first time ever. I went to Belarus to meet with President Lukashenko because of my concern about the possibility that Putin would find a way to reabsorb Belarus. This is incredibly important and very sensitive moment. So I think U.S. objectives here are twofold. One, keep Putin out of Belarus, keep him from interfering. And second, making sure that what I think we see yet another color revolution going on in the streets of the cities around Belarus, that this is something we should support, make clear we should support. The Trump administration has done very little publicly. It could well be there's a lot going on behind the scenes. I don't know. I can't comment on it. But I don't think anybody should say, as Trump often does, well, they're thousands of miles away and it's really not our issue. This is a big issue. And if I could put it this way, I'd say, hey, President Trump, this could be really politically beneficial for you domestically to take a strong stand in favor of the the Belarusian opposition. Maybe that would help convince him to do something dramatic.
Thank you. We have a question from Gazeta Express newspaper in Kosovo. What are your expectations from the September 2nd meeting between Kosovo and Serbia in the White House? And do you think there could be a final agreement that could include economical and political issues?
Well, I think it'll be a great campaign event for President Trump. I hope it helps in the negotiations between Kosovo and Serbia. I think that it's very much in the interest of the United States to resolve each of the remaining Balkan area disputes, of which there are still a fair number. I think that the instability caused by not being able to regularize the relationship between Kosovo and Serbia just gives Russia fissures that it can work its way into and increase that instability. There was a time a couple of years ago when I think people were optimistic that the leaders of Kosovo and Serbia had worked out something, at least in general terms. I think that's fallen away a little bit. But is it in the interest of the United States, whether in public or behind the scenes, to work to see if we can't have those two countries reach agreement? I think it very much is. And if that's what the administration's doing, then I applaud it.
President Trump, as you know, criticizes the press on a daily and oftentimes even an hourly basis. What's your take on the role of the press in covering this administration?
Well, in terms of criticism, all I'd say to the press is welcome to the club. It's a very distinguished group of people. Um, I think it's perfectly natural for incumbent administrations to criticize the press. I personally think the press is biased to the left. I think there's no little empirical doubt of that. And I think it often relies on conventional wisdom in its coverage of current events. But I don't think the press is the enemy of the people. I don't think our civic political discourse is advanced by that kind of criticism. But I think a little healthy rivalry between the government and the press is a good thing for democracy.
And it's been around since the beginning of the country.
Well, it started, really with Hamilton and Jefferson both using government funds to help subsidize newspapers that attacked each other. So it does go back a long way.
Are there stories that you'd like to see the press covering right now that have not been explored yet?
Well, I guess if we're still in the arena of criticizing the press, I think the press's attention span and historical knowledge are too short. And I think I understand the pressure to get out with the story first and whatnot, but it is fairly distressing to see kind of a lack of historical perspective in a lot of the press's reporting. So if they in their educational days had spent more time studying American history, I would feel a lot better.
We have a question from Elaine Louise Baptiste. Do you think Antifa should be designated as a terrorist organization? What about the Ku Klux Klan?
Well, look, you're talking about domestic American protest movements, and I think it's not an endorsement of anybody's position to say they shouldn't necessarily be designated as a terrorist organization. And it's an easy political thing to do, and I have no sympathy whatever for either the Ku Klux Klan or Antifa. But I'm also a strong believer in political freedom, and I'm just very reluctant to go after groups, especially amorphous groups, and therefore individuals. If they commit individually or collectively acts that violate the law, I think they should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of it. But I'm not a virtue signaler. I don't like putting labels on things. If people violate the law, throw them in the slammer.
We're in the midst of this coronavirus crisis. We're seeing an outcry across the country for racial equality and social justice. The economy is pretty uncertain at this point. Can you comment, in your opinion, on how you think the president is handling each of these? We can unpack them if you want, or you can look at them as a whole.
Well, let's start with the coronavirus. I think it's perfectly obvious that from the beginning there was an empty chair in the Oval Office. Staff at the NSC, the Centers for Disease Control, because I was out of the government at the time, but in early January, were raising red flags about this. Trump didn't want to hear about them. He didn't want to hear bad things about Xi Jinping. He didn't want to hear that China was engaged in a cover-up of what had gone on in Wuhan and elsewhere in China, was engaged in an international disinformation campaign about the disease. He didn't want to hear that China might not be able to comply with the terms of the interim trade deal that he was working on and in fact, I think signed in January. And he particularly didn't want to hear that this disease could be of such serious consequence that it might interfere with the U.S. economy, which he saw as his ticket to re-election. And I think that attitude, which was sustained for a very long period of time, including some actions that restricted travel from China, which were a good thing, but which were hardly comprehensive, were indicative of the lack of strategic thinking at the very top level about how to deal with coronavirus. And to this day, at the national government level, we're not acting in a fully strategic fashion. I'm not saying there aren't elements of things that are being done. They're being done all the time, looking for vaccines, looking for testing. but there's no strategy. A list of actions on a piece of paper is not a strategy. That's the responsibility of the president, and I think he's failed in that. I think the consequence of not approaching this that way is that the course of the disease has been more damaging, more deadly than it had to be, and the consequences for the economy are worse than they had to be.
We're in the midst of commemorating last week, this week, through September 2nd, when the surrender was signed, the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, a time when this country came together in spectacular fashion. Should we be treating the coronavirus crisis as we would a war of that magnitude? Do you see us coming together as a nation in order to combat this with a national strategy and with a spirit of cooperation?
Well, I don't see any evidence that that's happening now. I think certainly Trump is responsible for part of it, but he's not responsible for all of it. I think one lesson that I think we should learn from it, that I think our adversaries around the world are watching very carefully, is the lack of effectiveness of our response. Tells them that biological weapons are a much more viable option against the United States than perhaps they'd thought before. This is one of the realities of a pandemic, even a natural pandemic, is that it has many of the same characteristics as a biological weapons attack. It's not for nothing that chemical and biological weapons were called the poor man's nuclear weapon. So it's potentially easier to get hold of biological weapons than nuclear weapons, and it's hard to attribute their origin. I think it's a real danger for us that we need to have some sensible people address.
And so we've talked about the coronavirus, and we've talked about a bit about the impact on the economy. There's that other major issue here, this outcry for racial equality and social justice that we're seeing playing out in the streets across America, and the world is watching our response to that as well. Could you offer your thoughts on how best to move forward on that front?
Well, I think this is obviously something that's gripped the United States for a long time, going back to the introduction of slavery into the country and our efforts to eradicate it and to deal with the consequences of it. And I don't think our response has been perfect, but I think that that we've made a lot of progress in the last half century, and we shouldn't ignore that. I think we ought to ask ourselves, what is our objective ultimately? And I think the objective is still what Martin Luther King said in the March in Washington in 1963, when he said he looked forward to a day when people were judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. And I think that's the objective, and we ought to measure the steps we take against that objective. That to me is the essence of American society. We are a country of individuals, and we ought to treat everybody as an individual, judge them by the content of their character and not the color of their skin.
Thank you. You've worked in the administrations of Presidents Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump. Can you take a few minutes and compare and contrast them in terms of their leadership qualities, what they brought to the mix, and perhaps what we can learn from each of these people?
Well, I think Ronald Reagan was the most inspiring of the four of them. He was a great visionary leader. He could communicate, as everybody knows, called him the great communicator, and he knew what he wanted to do. And sometimes it was summed up in very grand phrases, sometimes in more commonplace ones. He was direct enough to say, in one of his internal deliberations, here's how we end the Cold War. We win and they lose. That's exactly right. That's what the objective always should have been. And that's what happened. We won and they lost. But he could also express it in ways that inspired people. when he said in Berlin, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Those words will live forever. And of course, they were opposed by the State Department from going into the speech. But working for Reagan was a dream, and I think he remains really the outstanding president in my lifetime. George H.W. Bush was a consummate international statesman, and he performed what many thought would be the nearly impossible task of finishing what Reagan and predecessors had started in terms of the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the victory over communism, and he did it peacefully. He expelled Saddam Hussein from Kuwait and really opened up the possibility of, with the end of the Cold War, that people found difficult to contemplate. And his reward for all that was to be voted out of office in 1992. But he and his entire administration, of which I was a small part, I think did a masterful job. And in many of the roles he had, Brent Scowcroft, who just passed away, Jim Baker, Dick Cheney were outstanding examples of American international leadership at its finest. George W. Bush, closer in age to me, obviously, I think did a really fantastic job in trying to make America a safer place. This obviously gets into the huge disagreement over the toppling of Saddam Hussein, a decision I still think is correct. And I admired President Bush for his international leadership as well. Donald Trump is not an international leader. I don't think he fully understands what he's doing in international affairs. I don't think he understands even the complexities of the U.S. government. And what's worse is he shows no particular interest in learning. That's why I consider that we've been fortunate to get past 3.5 years here without major international difficulty. I'm excluding coronavirus from that for the moment, but also why I don't think we can entrust him with another 4 years.
Is there anything you admire about President Trump?
Look, he can be gracious when he wants to be, and he's certainly got a focus on being reelected that I think no other president's had.
What's your takeaway after writing the book and going through everything you did and getting the book published and getting it out there? Talk for a minute about your takeaway from the book and what you would like the takeaway of others to be.
Well, I tried to write history in this book. It's a memoir, so it doesn't purport to be comprehensive. It's history as I saw it. One of the reasons I was determined to publish it was to make sure it was there for the historical record. People can agree with it or disagree with it. They can pick away at this factual aspect or that, but it's there, and I hope it will be helpful not just to historians but to the people as well. And I felt that bringing it out when it came out in the middle of a presidential election was important to give the American people a chance to draw their own conclusions. They can agree with me or disagree, but they can read the book, and then it's up to them to decide. A lot of people are critical because I brought it out before the end of the president's term. And I just say this: if you can't relate the competence and integrity of a president during the presidential campaign, if those aren't fair subjects for discussion, then when are they a fair subject for discussion?
What's next for you after the book?
Well, I'm going to go back to doing a lot of what I was doing before I joined the administration, and certainly in my own personal business areas. In political terms, I'm going to focus on trying to maintain Republican control of the Senate, which in many respects I think is more important even than who wins the presidential election. And I hope to be very active in the post-election conversation about the future of conservatism and the future of the Republican Party, especially immediately, as I said before, if Trump loses.
At the beginning of our conversation, you quoted Abraham Lincoln. I'd like to go back to Lincoln and his first inaugural address in 1861. In an effort to avoid the Civil War, he closed his first inaugural address with an impassioned plea. Lincoln said, "I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." Where are the better angels of our nature today? Are they still out there?
Well, they're out there, but I think they're on the sidelines. And again, I think while Trump is responsible for some of it, he's not responsible for all of it. I think a lot of this goes back to what began in the Reagan administration. When you look at what was done to his Supreme Court nominees, the attacks on Rehnquist, the attacks on Bob Bork, deeply personal attacks, and it's become more common since then. I think if there were a way to get back to a more civic discourse, a more civil discourse, I think we ought to try and do that. I don't see any prospect of that between now and November the 3rd, but I think people need to pay attention to it. And I don't think it's beyond us by any stretch of the imagination. Sometimes you have to hit bottom before you can come back up. I think we're pretty much at the bottom now. But we'll see what happens in November.
And as you look back, what are your most proud moments of your career?
Well, what I've tried to do really since I first got involved in political activity when I was all of 15 years old, working to hand out leaflets and knock on doors for Barry Goldwater, I've tried to advance a philosophy that stresses freedom for the individual in the United States and security for the United States around the world. There are a number of moments that come to mind, but I see the effort as starting then and continuing as long as I can. And if people understand that about what I've tried to do, I don't care if they get some of the details wrong. That's the most important thing to me.
Okay. And that'll be our last word today. Ambassador John Bolton, we thank you for joining us. The book is entitled "The Room Where It Happened, a White House Memoir." Ambassador Bolton, as we do with all of our newsmaker guests, we're going to be sending you our National Press Club coffee mug, along with an invitation to join us again in person in the near future. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Our thanks to our producer, Lindsay Underwood, our headliners, co-team leaders, Donaline Juan Legere and Lori Russo, the coordinator of today's program, Joyce Frieden, and our terrific National Press Club team behind the scenes here in the Broadcast Operations Center. We thank our members and guests for your good questions and for joining us. Be well, stay safe, and have a good day.